I'm Jason Clark. We're here from Columbus, Ohio, and our daughter, who is 7 years old, has anti-MOG.
I'm Rebecca Clark, sorry.
I'm Penny Stewart, and originally I was diagnosed with TM, but had a full-blown NMO attack in 2017, so I'm the NMO component here.
I'm Shane Roof. I have acute flaccid-myelitis, and I'm from Kentucky.
I'm Janelle Healy. I have transverse myelitis, and I'm from San Diego.
I'm Mary Clark, and this is my son Max Clark, and we're from Toledo, Ohio, and he has ADEM. He was diagnosed with ADEM.
And for the record, your last name didn't have to start with Clark in order to make it to the panel, but evidently that is one of the criteria. So it'll be easiest actually just to go in order. So for Clark family number one, if you wouldn't mind telling your story in terms of what you and your family have been through.
Okay. Our daughter became ill in late 2016 with strep throat, normal childhood illness, and it just didn't seem to get better. She was tired all the time, still sick and complaining of headaches and had a fever. She saw her pediatrician several times, including 4 to 5 visits to the emergency room. We just kept getting the same, oh, it's probably viral, even though her blood work showed she had very high white blood cell count. Her pediatrician was eventually able to get her admitted into the infectious disease unit at Nationwide Children's Hospital here in Columbus, where she was diagnosed with ADEM and transverse myelitis. While she was in the hospital, she briefly lost use of her legs, but that quickly came back. She actually didn't even need any steroid treatment or anything, and we were told we should not expect a recurrence, that ADEM and transverse myelitis was usually a one-off thing, and we went with that. She was discharged from neurology care at Nationwide in April of 2017, and we thought everything was fine. In August of 2018, she began complaining of headaches. She had a fever and started complaining of back and neck pain. We were again told it's probably a viral situation. 2 days after that, she woke up and she could not use her right arm, so she was admitted to the hospital, and at that point they tested for MOG and she was positive, and she's since recovered well, and we have no further relapses.
Great. Penny?
In 2006, I was diagnosed with transverse myelitis, and at that time there wasn't a lot of information. The doctors that I saw didn't know very much about transverse myelitis. I did see a neurologist who said, this is what you have, but there's nothing we can do for it, so go on and live your life, and we hope for the best. I was in the hospital for 4 days, got sent home. I couldn't feel anything from the chest down except what people with TM know, the girdling, the electrical current, the pain that comes even though you're numb. And they just sent me home and said, well, we'll come back in 6 weeks, we'll see what happens. So I did recover some sensation, but I have a lot of things that have stayed with me. But then, so I really wasn't following anybody, because they said I had a primary who knew what I had, but said there's nothing we can do for it. And I didn't even know what it was. I had to come home after being in the hospital for 4 days on steroids. I had to come home and Google it, and then I was terrified because I didn't know what was going to happen. So I basically went on and I had all the residuals that you get. I have pain and numbness and tingling in my arms. But then in 2017, I had a full-blown NMO attack. And I think it had actually started 2 years before that. I was having a lot of problems with my left eye, but the doctors kept saying it's this, it's that, but then it went to my right eye, and I couldn't, in 4 days I couldn't see anything. And so I was in the hospital and fortunately got with a neurologist who actually worked with Dr. Levy at some point, and he knew what it was, and I was diagnosed with NMO and told then at that point it has always been NMO. Once they diagnose you with one thing, like they said before, you don't have both, you have one or the other. So then I had steroids and Plex, plasma exchange, plasmapheresis, and then I take Rituxan every 6 months. And so that's hopefully to prevent further attacks. And so far I have not had a further attack, but the attack that I did have has left, of course, with residual vision problems.
Shane?
It was May 13th, 2017. It was just a normal day. We were getting ready for a party for Mother's Day, actually. And I went outside in the middle of the grass to get ready. And all day, I just felt off. It's like just extremely strange. And I was like, hey, Dad, I don't feel too well. Like, I didn't think too much of it at the time. And neither did we. So he was just like, oh, go lay down, buddy. Maybe you'll just feel better. So at the time, maybe just thought it was like a cold or a flu or something. And then, like, as time went by, I just kept going and going, and I just never felt better. So it's like, maybe, buddy, maybe you need to take a shower. Like, at this point, like, my legs started to feel funny. Like, they were almost, like, numb. So I was taking the shower. Like, after I got up, I tried to go up and down the stairs, and at, like, one point, like, my knees were buckling almost to the point where I, like, fell down. And, like, my mom's like, oh, my gosh, what's wrong with you, kid? Like, honestly, I don't know what you expect. Because it's crazy. Like, you don't think this would happen to somebody. So, like, all of a sudden, I felt like I needed to throw up. So I went down, lay down on the floor, and just dry heaved a little bit, and I couldn't get back up. So, like, at this point, I could move everything in my body, but everything was just extremely weak. So I couldn't get up. So I was like trying to push up and just couldn't do it. And like they just think I'm sick. And I don't blame them. I didn't know what to think either. But some of them just here stuck on the floor. And they had to help me get in the bed because I couldn't stand. And at this point, it's like something's wrong. So we went to go call the ambulance, and the first time they came, I know it sounds crazy, but the first time, but they're like, oh yeah, my breathing. I was breathing like extremely hard. Like the first time they came, it was like, oh, he's just having a panic attack. Like that's crazy. Should have brought me in the first time, but like after they left, stuff just started getting worse and worse. Like my breathing was like extremely labored. I was just so scared. So I was just trying to sleep and be both just laying down with my mom. I just knew something wasn't right. And I was like, I think you need to call the ambulance to go. So they called him again, and they put me in, and I felt like I was gonna die. So I'm like in the ambulance, like struggling to breathe for the air. It's like, oh, you need to give me the oxygen. And I'm like dying in there, and like they didn't know what was wrong because they had the mask on. But my diaphragm was actually like in the process of being like paralyzed, so the oxygen wasn't going to my lungs. They didn't know what to think. So at the time that I was in the ER, everybody's like asking me questions, like if I've done drugs or had alcohol or anything. I mean, I'm a good kid, I didn't do any of that. So then of course I answered no to all that. But then it was crazy. It was like they didn't know what to do, and some guy had a crazy idea to put a BiPAP on me. That's basically saved my life. Because at that point, it was like I was out, like screaming, almost like I couldn't breathe. And after that, it was like it's a giant blur, but lots of therapy, what, like tons of physical therapy, like pulmonary rehab, treadmill, yeah. Locomotor training every day.
Yeah, he was initially, when we got to the ICU, within hours, we realized that he was paralyzed from the neck down. And, he was intubated, and we had an MRI done, and they found an infarction in his spinal cord. And, that's when, we knew something was terrible wrong. So, however, we were in the ICU for about 30 days, and then we went directly to inpatient to Fraser Rehab, and we were inpatient for probably 3.5, 4 months. And during that time, he got off the ventilator during the day, and he also started walking again with some assistance. And it's been a crazy journey, but he's moving forward, and we're proud of him.
Janelle?
So I have transverse myelitis. My initial onset was very quick. My lesion is from my C2 to C7, and the way it started was in my left hand. The numbness, tingling, just progressed up and then progressed down. Similar experience when I was at the community hospital. They were going to discharge me because they thought I was on drugs. And then when they went to get me out of the hospital bed, I fell over because while I was laying, I lost my core without realizing it. And then eventually they put me in a CAT scan. And while I was laying in there, I heard the text saying, well, if this girl can't move, she should be getting an MRI. So that made me feel really great about the treatment. And eventually I got an MRI in the middle of the night, and that's where they found the lesion from my C2 to C7. Was in ICU for a while, and then when I stabilized, because I was very fortunate in the fact that while my breathing was impacted, they got steroids in me and started doing breathing treatments immediately, so I was able to avoid ventilation. But once I stabilized, they moved me to HUP, Hospital of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I got more treatments, plaques, plasma exchange. I had some Rituxan treatments because they were actually treating me as if I had NMO due to the lesion and how long it was in my spinal cord. So I'm grateful that they were at least proactive in that regard. But yeah, it's challenging, as I'm sure we can all deal with when we know something's wrong with us, but nobody really knows necessarily enough to help figure it out for us since we're just the patients. So it's a wonderful experience coming here. But yeah, that's a shortened version of my story.
Okay, I'm going to speak on Max's behalf because he's still working on speaking clearly. Max was 17 and he had the flu with the rest of us, and he went to sleep that evening, and I said, okay, we'll see you in the morning for school. And he's like, okay, Mom. And I went in the morning, I'm like, why is he not awake? And so I went to his room, and he was already unresponsive and, like in a coma at that point. We rushed him to the hospital, and yes, they gave him Narcan as well, thinking he's 17, so he was on drugs. So we got there, and he was very sick. They didn't know what was wrong with him. And after numerous tests, within 8 hours, because they did do an MRI, within 8 hours, they did tell us that he had something very rare called ADEM, which we had never heard about. And most of the people in our community have no idea what it is. They don't know what transverse myelitis is either. So we struggle working with doctors and therapists especially that don't have a clue of what he has. But we were in the hospital as well, ICU for 45 days, and then rehab floor for about another 4 months. And then we have been home since then doing rehab. Physical therapy as often as we can get there, and as often as insurance will allow us to get there, which is a big fight, and a big fight with the therapists who, well, if you come on Monday, we want you to have the skill of moving your arm mastered by Thursday. Well, that's not going to happen. So we need a lot of time, and the brain is healing, and the myelin sheath is healing, and we need a lot of time and repetition. So We work with Max a lot at home. We're fortunate because we have a great nursing staff to come and help us at home. And we do therapy at home and exercise as much as we can. And we were here 2 years ago. Max was not well enough to come. So his dad and I were here, and we learned a lot of wonderful information, met a lot of wonderful people, and we've used that information and gone back and told the therapist actually what to do. And because of that, he is doing much better, and he can actually be here today. So we're grateful to the TMA and all the doctors and Sandy, so we appreciate that.
So now, I'll take what's referred to at scientific conferences as the chair's privilege, where I get to ask some questions, but I'm going to open it up for the whole audience to ask any questions you have. But I just want to ask the whole group as a whole, by show of hands, just an interesting experiment. How many of you can remember in detail exactly what you had for lunch 2 weeks ago? All right, so no hands. How many of you can remember in detail what you were doing the day of or the day before this occurred? Okay, so this is forever ingrained in a different way, the before and after. How many of you were, and I think we heard it, initially misdiagnosed relative to your ultimate diagnosis? Somewhat, okay? How many of you are worried about recurrence, new events happening? And then for how many of you, when you were in the hospital or your initial visits, were you one of the first or in the first 10 of patients that your clinicians had seen with this disorder? So everybody here has a very different title. Somebody who's been affected by the anti-MOG antibody, neuromyelitis optica, ADEM, acute flaccid myelitis, transverse myelitis, and it would be extremely easy for, frankly, each of you to want an organization focused solely on your title, an organization that meets the needs of ins and outs of every family who's been affected by the anti-MOG antibody. And that would be a very natural desire to have. One of the things we find within the association, and from an outsider's perspective, meaning a clinician, not somebody who's been affected by one of these conditions, I'm thankful that I don't have an immediate family member who's been affected by these conditions. Every time one of my daughters gets a cold, I'm running through the list of what could happen. Every single time it's going through my head, and it turns out, thankfully, just to be a cold. But from the outside, it's amazing how much commonality there is in the stories and, frankly, in the biologies of what affects everybody here. And so we thought it would be useful just to highlight for everybody the diversity of needs, the diversity of points of view, the diversity of fears, but also the commonality. And so with the few minutes we have left, I'm happy to open this up to the floor to see if anyone has questions for any of our panelists. And there is a microphone, so if you raise your hand, a microphone will come to you.
How do you pay for it all?
How do you pay for it all? So I'm sure there's no financial strain at all relative to the U.S. healthcare system and getting the care you need. So I don't know why we're even asking, but just in case, does anyone want to comment on the finances?
First and foremost, I don't know your story or how you're affected. I don't know if you're in works with your state vocational rehabilitation department. I will be quite frank and blunt. My state, when I was diagnosed, was Pennsylvania. They helped me tremendously. They helped me so much, I became a vocational rehabilitation counselor. They actually helped pay for my driving to get certified again. They helped pay to get a lift put into my car to get my mobility scooter in and out so that I can be somewhat independent. They also helped honestly pay for an FES stim bike for me. So if you have not reached out to your state rehabilitation department, I highly encourage it. Obviously, there's different stipulations for each state, different guidelines, but they, for me, were a huge asset.
So move to Pennsylvania, that's option number one. What else? Does anyone else have a comment on?
I have regular insurance through my federal job. However, with Shane's condition, he was able to get a Medicaid waiver. So what my current regular insurance doesn't pay for, Medicaid picks up. However, that being said, therapy is an issue. Luckily for us, we've had help from the Shriners and different organizations to help pick up some of the therapy visits, which is much needed. And regular insurance does not cover nowhere near enough therapy for situations like this, and unfortunately that's a problem. But we deal with it through different ways with charities and whatnot.
Do you want to make something? Yeah.
We're very fortunate we have great insurance that's covered the medical care, but especially for people that have to travel for care with children, reach out to Ronald McDonald Houses, speak with the provider that you're going to see. If you're flying, they may be able to provide you with airline tickets, housing at the Ronald McDonald House or a similar entity. You can save thousands of dollars just on one trip, and that could extend for years. If you're going once every 6 months or once every year, it can really add up.
And so I think you're hearing about just accessing resources and being creative to search. There's one other thing that we recommend in our clinic on a regular basis is for private insurance or managed healthcare organizations, they are supposed to provide upon request case managers or ombudsmans. Different insurance companies call it different names, but basically you get assigned one person to contact. So you get assigned Betty. So every time you call, you're not getting a different person, you always get Betty, and you don't have to retell your story each time. And that person is supposed to be your advocate within the insurance company. So if you're hitting brick walls, they're supposed to help you navigate. And I will tell you, there's an assumption that you cannot negotiate with your health insurance company. It's actually wrong. You can make trades on policies. You can say, for this year, I don't want as many inpatient rehab day benefits. I'd like more outpatient. Can we make a swap? Now, if you end up needing inpatient, there's a risk to that because they're going to cap it, but there are things you can do with your insurance company, not all. And so, but it's worth investigating with whomever your third-party payer is, what the options are for tweaking your personal care plan. So, any other question?
So I have transverse myelitis. So the question could be for everybody though, because I'm not exactly sure how your symptoms started. But so when I was diagnosed, I hadn't lost anything physically other than a numb hand. And then I had a flare-up a year after being diagnosed, which I had only hoped, well, I hope I don't get MS or something worse, because at the time I could still walk, run, jump, and everything. So then when I had a flare-up a year later, I thought, okay, this must be something that's progressing, because everything I'd looked up online, it was supposed to be, it happens once, and then you deal with it. And so I thought that it was something worse, and I was just wondering how your guys, did your symptoms come on, or early, late? I mean, because it kind of plateaued. I mean, it stopped after that one flare-up. Nothing changed in lesions, but I was just wondering if yours all came on at once and you've been dealing with it since, or if it was over a long time.
Yeah, so that's a good question. For me, mine all came on within 8 hours. I was a complete quadriplegic. And I've just had slow recovery since then. Similar, maybe, I don't know how severe your second attack, let's say, was. I've had instances where my hands will go numb. They don't necessarily know why. I've heard, I'm not sure, my one neurologist told me that if it doesn't last for more than 24 hours, not to worry about it. I'm not sure about the seriousness of that.
24 hours.
Yeah. So I've, my significant other Jay can speak on that. I have some issues when parts of my body go numb, just because that's how it all started for me. They say it's idiopathic transverse myelitis, but with all the new diagnoses that come out, sometimes I can't help but wonder, is it truly TM, or was that just what it was then? So for me, I can only speak for what I would do, but anytime I experience new symptoms, I always try to reach out to my neurologist. I was on a weird schedule. My original neurologist had me getting an MRI every year, because I think he thought that I was going to develop MS, just based on my characteristics. Knock on wood, that hasn't happened. But yeah, it's always good if you personally again, just speaking on my own self, if I feel something's different, I am way more proactive. So I'll reach out and, you know, if I have to pay a couple $100s to get an MRI just to have peace of mind, I'll do it, because I feel like we all kind of understand that feeling where you don't know, and our bodies are magnificent and crazy. So we literally have no control. So that's always just my advice, just be proactive.
I mean, I hate going to the hospital, but it's definitely pays off to know that something bad's not gonna happen. Like, other day I had to go to the ER because my legs were swelling. So I figured out that was my, like, kidneys or something. But it sucks, but you need to know, you know.
Yeah, and so 2 points to make. So if there's ever more than one event, it's worth seeing your clinicians to visit the diagnosis and what things are, and everyone here is welcome to make use of the medical professionals over this weekend, and if you have questions, we're happy to help in any way we can, as best we can. But secondly, I'll just point out, based on both your stories, and actually all the stories up here, when the Transverse Myelitis Association started 25 years ago, some of these diagnoses didn't exist as an independent diagnosis, and we as healthcare professionals, clinicians, and scientists reserve the right to change the names of your diagnosis at any time. We're on a 5 to 8 year cycle right now, and it drives Sandy a little nuts, and we're not doing it just for fun or for sport. We're doing it because we're getting smarter because of you. So what separates out quote, experts in a condition versus not? It's just how many patients we see. It's not, we didn't read more books, we didn't study harder. It's once you see 100 of something, you start to pick up on patterns. So my education in this endeavor, in this journey that I've taken, hasn't been from any textbook. It's literally been from all of you. I took part in one of the worst titled papers in history between 2012 and 2014 called the Transverse Myelitis Plus Syndrome. It turned out to be acute flaccid myelitis. I just didn't know what I was seeing. And so my nomenclature, my dogma, my silos were to take anybody with inflammation in the spinal cord and call it transverse myelitis. And right in front of us, acute flaccid myelitis was occurring. We just didn't realize it. It took seeing enough of you to recognize the differences. It takes seeing enough individuals with a quote diagnosis of transverse myelitis coming back with a new symptom to recognize that maybe anti-MOG antibody syndrome is a distinct category that's different than idiopathic transverse myelitis. And so always revisit with your clinicians, not just for social reasons, but presumably each year we're going to get a little smarter thanks to you guys and sharing your stories. So I think we have time for another question. There was
I was diagnosed many years later because nobody knew what transverse myelitis was in 1985. And Doug Kerr actually said, I know what you have, and introduced me to this world. My question, I guess, is you guys are also new compared to me, is what do you guys see in long-term effects? Because having been 30 plus years with TM and having multiple changes and nobody knowing what to do about it, is it because of TM or is it something else? And that's where I'm trying to find more information.
Yeah, and I'll turn to the panel. Have there been conversations with your healthcare providers, and everyone's in a different situation, relative to the other things that can happen in our health and our lives that take a different effect on our bodies relative to the neurologic diagnosis?
Yeah, so I find a lot of my medical professionals want to just blame everything on TM. And I know it's not true, so a lot of times I have to do a lot of advocating for myself, which is frustrating. But you know, I've had it for almost 7 years now. I was originally diagnosed in January of 2013. For me, I'm noticing just the way I sit and the way when I can ambulate, the way I do that, I'm starting to get a lot of hip pain in my left side. And I know that it's partly because of transverse myelitis, but the transverse myelitis is not directly causing the pain. So for me, I don't know how we can do this, but just educating more medical professionals and not just umbrellaing. I'm making up new words. Anyway, and not just putting everything under that umbrella of your initial diagnosis, because I'm sure, as we all can attest to, while yeah, we have this diagnosis, we're also still humans. Other things happen to us. We get sickness, you know what I mean? It hasn't happened to me, but people can also still develop cancer. The TM didn't cause that, the NMO didn't cause that, that's just your body. And so for me, I'm really struggling with it now that I've relocated to San Diego, is just finding medical professionals that can work together. I was super fortunate on the East Coast, and I kind of miss it in that regard for the medical professionals. But just in San Diego alone, there's nobody who really even gets transverse myelitis or rare neuroimmune disorders, let alone how the rest of our body and system interacts. So if it makes you feel better, you're not alone.
I think that like what AFM has done to me has already happened. I don't think it can do anything more. But I think that what really hurts is what we're doing to fix these things causes the problems. Like I'm on a ventilator at night, and that like I wake up and I just feel so like bloated because it pushes like air inside of me, and like now we're like trying so many other things, just trying to fix that. So it's just like every time you try to fix something, something else happens. It's like compiles on top of each other.
I was gonna say, when I first had the start of the NMO attack, when I had the transverse myelitis was 2006, so there wasn't a lot of information. My neurologist said, your primary will explain it to you, and my primary said the neurologist will explain it to you, and they sent me home, and I wasn't any better. I could walk, but I wasn't any better, and they couldn't tell me, nobody told me anything until I Googled it. But when I had the eye problem, and I was seeing an eye doctor, he didn't have any idea what NMO was. So I remember him telling his resident, well, she has TM, but that's really just a variant of MS, which I knew was not true, but I knew that was his, idea of it. And then when, it was actually he finally sent me, because I was getting much worse over days, and he gave me steroid eye drops. He says, come back in a week, and I said, I had to call him and say, oh no, I'm going blind. I can't see. So he brought me in at the end of the day, but he had consulted with a neuro-ophthalmologist, thank goodness, and that neuro-ophthalmologist knew what I had. But one of the residents that worked with him came in, because he does all the prelim stuff, and he said, yeah, what you have is NMO, but he said, and they'll treat it, but it just comes back, and you're gonna go blind, and you're gonna be paralyzed. And I was terrified, but fortunately, I got to a neurologist who said, no, we can treat this, we don't know. So I still live with that fear that I'm gonna be blind, or I'm gonna be paralyzed. So every day you wake up, you think, okay, today I can see, today I can walk. I have a lot of residuals, but, I just don't know what tomorrow. So you don't know, and that's the same thing, like, sometimes things I just got a posterior vitreous detachment, which probably nobody knows what that is either, but that is an eye problem which causes flashes and floaters, and I'm thinking, I'm having another NMO attack. So again, it was a different thing though, so you still get other health problems. You just never know if it's all in the same category.
I'd just like to add to the question.
Yep.
I was diagnosed 55 years ago with TM in
Wow.
1964.
Wow.
And I became quadriplegic overnight. After 3 months in the hospital, I walked out with one cane. After a year, I ditched the cane. And then I lived a perfectly normal life, except for a slight limp. This was way before I ever, had anybody else that ever had it. I thought I was the only person in the world that had this. And then I discovered Sandy Siegel with the TM Association. My mind was blown away with that.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a word about, after having it for so long, what can happen to you. Well, about 15 years ago, I started to see symptoms. My body was, I think I recovered 90 to 95%, but the left side of my body had to constantly compensate for the percentage that was bad. After a knee replacement on the bad leg, I had to start walking with a cane, then I graduated to a walker, a simple walker, and then a deluxe model walker. This walker is like a Rolls Royce. So I think after you've had it a long time, at least in my case, you can start to feel things. And I just feel like I'm going down with the years. And my age is there. I was 20 when it happened. I'm 75 now. This, when I got it, it was before MRIs were even invented.
How did the doctor diagnose the system?
Yeah, they did a myelogram and a spinal tap, and they did it by a process of elimination. They were looking for maybe a brain tumor or a stroke or whatever. They just eliminated things. And then another interesting thing is when I started having problems, you know, bladder, bowel, the whole whatever can come with it, in later years, one doctor told me I was going through an accelerated aging process. Accelerated aging process. And then I moved, I used to live in the United States in Syracuse, New York, but then I moved after my husband passed away to Canada, which has a totally different medical system. They all thought I had to find a neurologist, physiatrist, doctors, a whole thing all over again. And they thought, oh, I wasn't really diagnosed with TM. They said back then they didn't really know anything about this. You probably have NMO. So I had to go through all the tests to rule out NMO. And then they confirmed I did have transverse myelitis.
So how many years did you go with this without knowing that you had lesions in your spine?
Oh, many, many years. I mean, I thought I had been cured or whatever, you know.
When MRIs were created, did they have?
No, I did. Yeah, I only went for that much later in life, and they did an MRI. And back then, people didn't keep records of their health. All my records got purged, you know, so I don't have any records from back then.
Well, thank you all for sharing and asking questions. I'd like to give our panel a round of applause and appreciate their time.